So the question becomes, what exactly is this practice of freedom, right? When we're talking about a practice, right? When we're talking about a practice, or to be technical, a praxis, now we recognize how the interrelation between reflection and action is signified, how it attains meaning, and I'll explain what that means in a second. All right. The first thing to recognize in the practice of freedom is that this practice denies the abstraction, right? It denies the abstraction and alienation of human beings, which is reinforced by the banking concept, right? So this denies alienation and isolation, right? It denies alienation and isolation. The practice of freedom, if we're talking about freedom, obviously it is impossible for an individual to talk about freedom and also talk about a system that reinforces alienation. They're two competing concepts, right? You cannot both embrace a system of freedom and embrace targeted alienation of members of a particular group, because then your freedom is selective. It's not genuine freedom, right? It's, at best, freedom to dominate others. When we're talking about liberation theory, as such, as we've said before, if we have the oppressor and we have a member of the oppressed group, it is not simply the liberation of, through struggle, it is not simply the liberation of the oppressed group, right? When we're talking about liberation, right, we mean liberation as such, right? So that we're talking about, when we're talking about liberation, we're talking about the liberation of both the oppressed group and the oppressor, right? The oppressor is, the liberation of the oppressor, however, is contingent on the recognition, the need for liberation by the oppressed group, right? The oppressor cannot liberate him or herself with his or her own volition, right? The liberation, as we've seen in Chapter 2, of the oppressor comes as a consequence of the attempted liberation of the oppressed group, right? So in discussing liberation, we recognize that it's liberation of both the oppressor and the oppressed group, and we can't describe or discuss this, right, this idea of liberation, if we still have individuals who are alienated, right? If alienation is reinforced, then the act of liberation has categorically failed, right? The whole motivation in recognition is recognizing the problems that arise in accepting alienation and dehumanization. All right, the next practice of, the next aspect of the practice of freedom is what Freire calls authentic reflection. Right? It's the idea of authentic reflection. And we'll see in a second exactly what authentic reflection is. Authentic reflection, right? And this is another category of benefit of the practice of freedom. Authentic reflection is the integration of human beings within the world, right? The integration, and I'm going to spend some time discussing this, right? It is the integration of human beings within the world, right? I'll just put humans within the world. Right? Anytime we're talking about the practice of freedom, we're talking about the incorporation, the integration of human beings within the world, right? And again, I'll talk a little bit about that. The first point to recognize in this idea of authentic reflection is that consciousness and the world are inextricably bound. Consciousness, right, this quote-unquote mental faculty, and the actual existence of the world are inseparable, right? There isn't a separation between the world and human beings, human minds. So, Freire gives the following example. He says, imagine that we live in a world, right? And imagine that world is inhabited by people. And imagine that I were to go to an individual and ask them about the world, right? They would be able to tell me about their particular experience of the world, right? And imagine that this is also a problem posing model, and we have an exchange of information. I'm not just informing, I'm also being informed by, right? Well, insofar as I'm being informed by and I'm informing, my interpretation of the world around me is going to be contextualized within my own sort of mental interpretive abilities. As we've seen before, information is always filtered through the existential experience of individuals, right? So as I'm engaged in a discussion, you take the information and you filter it through your life experience. You transform rather than transfer. You transform that information and you create some new interpretive mode. Well, what if people started to die, right? What if there's only one person left, and then the idea is, imagine that there are no people left, right? Could we have an account, a conscious account of the world? Well, the obvious answer is no, you can't, right? There is no conscious account of the world independent to the existence of human beings, right? Our consciousness of the world is contingent on two things. It's contingent on human beings, right, as social beings, right, and our interpretations of what? Well, our interpretations of this thing, the world, right, our interpretations of the world. And it'd be sort of like this, right? So that we have interpretations of the world which inform our discourse, and that's the stuff that we discuss, right? So when we're talking about consciousness, according to Freire, it is inappropriate to discuss consciousness as a faculty, a mental faculty, independent to our being in the world, right? The only reason that we are conscious, if you will, of our consciousness on sort of a meta level is because it refers to things in the world, right? It refers to the world. It's informed by the world. I don't want to go too much off a tangent. You can, because this is not so much Freire, but the objector immediately comes in and says, well, what about unicorns, right? There are no unicorns in the world. There's an easy response to that. Our ideas, our consciousness, our imagination either refers to that which is physical, objectual, right? Things in the world, physical things, or conceptual, right? Things that could possibly happen, possible existences, and so on. Either way, the totality of our consciousness is understood in terms of the relationship between the problem-posing model of education and discourse between human beings and our contemplation of the world while we're in the world.